Welcome to Filed, a monthly conversation with those at the convergence of data privacy, data security, data regulations, records, and governance. I'm Anthony Woodward, the CEO of RecordPoint, and with me today is my co-host, Chris Brown, our Executive Vice President of Partners, Evangelism, and Solutions Engineering. Today, we're welcoming to the pod Rob Williams, who is a fantastic guest and an expert consultant and founder of Prodi.ai, an AI-powered product development assistant. Rob, welcome to Filed.
Good to be here.
So, Rob, just for the listeners, that maybe take a moment just to sort of describe who you are, how you've come to be here, and certainly feel free to give us a little bit more detail about Prodi.ai.
So yeah, my name is Rob Williams, as you've said. Mainly my career is focused in product management. So worked for a number of different organizations as either product manager or then into the chief product officer role. And I spent quite a lot of that time in live entertainment. So worked for a lot of large venues, worked for a lot of software providers providing ticketing platforms to the likes of Wembley Stadium, etc. And then in the last couple of years, I've left that industry behind, really, and I left to start up a product management consultancy. And the kind of week I left was the week that ChatGPT was released. And so I just saw the writing on the wall. I'd been watching for a long time the progress of AI. And so I decided that was the point at which I was going to, instead of setting up a product management consultancy, I was going to set up an AI consultancy. So for the last 2.5, 3 years, I'm running an AI consultancy. I work with a bunch of great people at a company called Softhouse AI Advisory. One of the things I've done throughout that is really learning by experimentation. So setting up Prodi.io, setting up an app called Stoke, in full 3 AI startups that we've kind of launched, one that we're about to, all to do with really, for me, learning this new field. My kind of day job is advising organizations. I've been lucky enough to advise the American government, agriculture, insurance industries, again, some of my original live entertainment kind of colleagues and clients, a number of different organizations on using AI for productivity gain, efficiency gain, process automation, or using it within their own products. So really trying to help organizations ride this wave of generative AI and the kind of maturity of some of the traditional forms of AI in order to gain value. So that's my story. I suppose on the side, I'm also a keen AI advocate myself. So I use it for pretty much like everything. And I'll talk about that more.
Look, and I know we'll dive into that topic a little bit further in. I do want to come back just very quickly because I'm a mad English Premier League fan. I'm sure I probably said that on the pod before. So realistically, I should have known you many years ago for the hookup at Wembley because I have managed to get to a couple of games at Wembley, and certainly getting tickets from said agency was always very, very difficult and doing it the right way. But look, for today's episode, we're focusing on the concept of shadow AI, where employees of the company use free consumer versions of AI models to complete their work. Like myself, your ChatGPTs, your Copilots, etc. And look, I've seen stats that say that half of all employers are doing this, and that nearly 70% of workplace ChatGPT usage is through public and non-corporate accounts. Higher numbers apparently with things like Bard and Gemini. But this is the problem because that free commercial version of these AI models will use that prompt data and use the information you're putting in for training. I'm personally have a son who's involved in a number of sports, and we're always looking for additional ways to fundraise and other things. It's funny for myself in that ChatGPT now knows who I'm talking about. It's able to help without too much prompting with the details of the sport and other things. So they're absolutely using this data to train on. For those of us in corporate land, though, if an employee was to paste sensitive PII for analysis into these engines, that's going to make its way into the model. And certainly there's been lots of examples of that. What's your experience you've got on the ground? As you said, you've been advising people on this. What are you seeing in this space?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's a really interesting phenomenon from a couple of perspectives for me. One is that we're trying to add productivity to organizations. And so if the organization is already unofficially using AI, then that creates quite an interesting situation. And I've personally been in some discussions with engineering teams where some of the engineers have actually outright said, we don't want you to do this because we're already using this technology. Our managers haven't realized we're using it. We are getting a day, a week to ourselves. We're still outputting the same volume and quality of code we always were. And you're about to come in and ruin this. And I've actually had these conversations with people. And yeah, like the recent stats are showing 60 to 70% of knowledge workers are using AI. It's funny the way that I think a lot of this problem is because people haven't, and maybe now they're starting to, but haven't really grasped what is happening. And I remember very similar conversations happening years ago when Facebook started to become really popular. Twitter at the time started to become really popular. At that point, I was actually kind of in IT management, like my very early start. And I remember having conversations with people and saying, like, you're not going to ban this stuff. You don't realize this isn't just a website. This is becoming a fundamental part of people's lives. And so to ban people from, using some of these tools in the workplace, never mind even if it's just at your desk, but just in the workplace generally, and to start to penalize people for using these tools, these are social connection tools that are being used in order to allow people to remain mentally healthy. And now in hindsight, maybe there are also loads of challenges there, but I still stand by that. And I think what's happening with AI is people aren't realizing that these tools are becoming fundamental to the way people live, work, and breathe. And so, it's really difficult to even consider a shadow ban or a ban, on shadow AI. I'll show you this thing, and it's called Limitless, the Limitless AI pin. And what this does then is every morning it sends me a little message and it says, this is what you can do to make yourself a better person from all the things that you said yesterday. It's not focusing on what anyone else is saying, but what it's doing is giving me actually some really harsh feedback on a daily basis to say, you need to be less defensive, Rob. Yesterday, when you were speaking to this person, you were acting as though you knew everything and they were only trying to help. And yesterday, when you did this, it's giving me, solid feedback. That's a personal development piece of software. When I wear these, which are the Meta Ray-Bans, which again, I'm not going to put them on because they'll beep and glow and everything, but they have like Llama built in, they have a camera built in, etc. So what's happening is this technology is becoming so pervasive. And rather than embrace that, and rather than say, okay, we know you are going to use this stuff, what organizations are doing, and I think this is all part of that, the initial real, like tangible panic that security organizations and IT departments had of what was going to happen to this data, what they did was they just locked down really tight. And so I'm seeing on the ground a resentment towards that and a lack of understanding as to why there are these bans in place. But what I'm not really seeing is IT departments and organizations, except for the really progressive ones, embrace the technology and take the attitude of like, right, we understand you're going to start using this stuff, and here is the responsible way to do it. The irony is, for some of these tools, it's just a case of educating your employees to click a button and then they're opted out. But because of the clampdown, rather than the kind of encouragement and education, you're sort of seeing this rebellion happening, which again, throughout all of anyone who's worked in IT throughout all of our careers, the kind of shadow element of usage of any new tool that comes along is something that we all have to kind of understand. And I've always been a proponent of understanding it, embracing it, and then guiding the employees because, it's adding tangible benefit. The other thing I'd say, just quickly, what also isn't happening, and again, in some organizations is, and some of the things that I've been suggesting that organizations do, is to embrace those employees and ask them why and what their use cases are, why they're using this technology. Because actually, the interesting thing about shadow AI use within an IT organization is it's probably the single best way you can identify the solid use cases for this technology within your organization, because these employees are testing it for you, figuring it out, refining it, and you've probably got an incredible set of workflows and prompts and tools that you could bring in. So to summarize, I think it's absolutely real. I believe the stats that I see, I would say, depending on the organization, 60 to 70% of people using this technology. I think it's just a bleed over from the fact that more and more people are using it in their personal lives. But what I'm not seeing yet is a really organized response to that and a kind of understanding of it. I'm seeing a lot of like pushback. I'm having people come in and tell me, well, how do we stop it? And I'm saying, you are not going to stop this. Like, this is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. That's super interesting and almost quite poignant. We held a dinner recently for a number of executives in the financial services industry. I was in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, and we asked the question, where is everybody at the table? And the executives all took turns. And one of the larger financial services organizations, a global brand, was actually a really surprising answer. It was actually the opposite of the whole lockdown and where I thought they would have been, being that bigger, probably a little bit, considered conservative brand in the market, but
Right.
they've actually gone the other way and pushed out a whole bunch of training to everybody in the organization to understand that the tools exist. They've started to push the tools on them and say, take the time to make this a part of your day-to-day workflow. Take that opportunity to sort of see and feel. And they've obviously got people watching what's going on and trying to generate those use cases. Like, where are we seeing value in this? And I think the rest of the table, again, and I'm obviously representing their thoughts in of my own here, but we're quite surprised by that larger, quite global conservative brand being engaged in that way, but also then the other side of encouraging its use and formally pressing the people to actively use AI in their day to day. As you said, back to trying to get that productivity. I know we sort of focused a little bit there on the employee side. In your role and in the organizations you're speaking with, what are leaders saying about this? Like, obviously shadow AI, and I think, the social media aspect is exactly the same. Obviously at a defense level, you understand why the phones go into cabinets and watches are taken off and they don't want those other things. There's a lot more espionage and sabotage and these other things that go on. But for most of us from a day to day, we're probably not worried about those things. What are you hearing from the leaders as it relates to shadow AI? And we had a couple of board members at this dinner as well, and the same thing was true. They were very much, we don't want to end up on the front page of the newspaper. We don't want to have the mistakes made. But what are they really saying when you're interacting with them?
Yeah, a lot of the organizations I work with are starting their journey to, adopt AI. And so there's a real split of a lot of people, and this is maybe a gross generalization, but a lot of the time I tend to find that there is less AI knowledge and understanding at the top of the organization. And so there's sometimes a complete kind of ignorance to what's happening. So like, we don't think people are really using it here. So I often have these surveys as part of a training or an inspiration day that I'll do across an organization. And I'll actually kind of anonymously ask. And generally speaking, leaders are really surprised at the widespread use of the technology. And again, it comes back to what I said earlier, that this has become something that's far beyond just a single tool that we use for one purpose. What I also find is, again, there is this real feeling of risk and like danger around these tools. It's interesting. When we started this conversation and when you were first talking, you were talking about the kind of this view that this data that goes into these AIs ends up training the model and can end up coming out when someone else is just querying questions and stuff. And I would say that's the number one challenge I come across for people adopting AI full stop in organizations. And so at leadership level, there is this extreme paranoia around that concept. I think personally, for me, the jury is out on really how accurate a description of a risk that particular concept is. Now, I completely understand if you are giving these models data and you're having a conversation with these models, then that's stored. And if OpenAI got hacked, then there is a risk there, in the same way as if you're emailing someone or you're storing that data in iCloud or in 365. And one of the things I talk to these organizations about is, I'm going to say something now that's a little bit maybe controversial, and I'm not suggesting that we don't pay extreme attention to the security. And, if you're an organization that has any risk of any of that data going in, then enterprise plans, ChatGPT Enterprise, GDPR and PIPA compliant. These models, the way that they are trained is really, in the way that a neural network works, is really about burning data into the network. It's burning patterns. And really that's what it is. It's not text, it's patterns and linkages of text into that network. And so unless you are Coca-Cola and every single employee is putting the formula in all the time, the risk actually, in my view, is relatively low because you are not going to influence that model. And the reason you're not going to influence it is because if you imagine a situation where everyone who unticked that box and started talking to ChatGPT was influencing the actual training data of the model, the actual weights in real terms, then what would the AI be saying? It would not know what the difference between authoritative knowledge and just someone saying something. It would become a mess. And so, in my view, there's been an overblown risk there, which I think was born out of the very, very first versions of ChatGPT specifically, where they were heavily weighting that initial training because they were still kind of building out the model. They didn't have the option for you to turn this stuff off in the product. And there were a load of developers and various people who gave specific examples. Although those examples, if you look into every single one, there was always some element of that information being on the public internet. And I think that is where the core of ChatGPT, of these models, is trained, is the public internet. But a lot of the time, the data doesn't leak from people using the model. A lot of the time, it leaks from bad security around a public internet site, or data that's on the internet, or data that's behind a paywall, and a lack of understanding that these things, and this is where there is a challenge, these things are trained through paywalls. They are trained on data that you wouldn't necessarily think is public, but in my opinion, they're trained primarily on that public data. And actually, the training data that's used, the thumbs up, the thumbs down, it's not used to train the model. It's used actually to create a better experience for users in terms of the UI and the way the model behaves. And so that's something it's an interesting thing to pitch, especially if you're pitching it to the CTO or the InfoSec team, because you almost have to then have a rolling caveat at the bottom that says, I'm in no way suggesting that you should encourage this. But the reality, I think, is that it's an overblown risk. And so that's what I see. I see this real fear that is holding the leadership back. And then the flip of that, when I start to show them what this technology can do, is this kind of understanding and epiphany that being held back on AI technology that is kind of happening right now is a death sentence, I feel, for a company. In the same way as, let's be really clear, like regulation is not going to work here, because you are regulating against like GDP. You literally are regulating against the productivity of the country. So I'm watching to see what happens across the EU. But I think we need to really recognize that this train has left the station, the wave is rolling forward. And these leaders, when they start to see what you can practically do, that's when they start to embrace it. I do think there is this real kind of wake up moment now that needs to occur, that, the hype train has gone. The product is still accelerating. The technology is still accelerating faster than it ever was. I do a lot of speaking engagements where I talk about Gartner's hype cycle. If you've come across it, I love it. I talk about it all the time. This has broken the hype cycle.
I've never heard anybody say they love the hype cycle. That's the thing.
Harsh. I tell you why I love it. I love it because it's a really good way of explaining why people misunderstand like hype. When you look at something like blockchain, that it's my way of saying this isn't hype, but it is currently at the peak of the cycle. It will eventually come down and it will eventually get into the plateau. And it's just about how long. The hype cycle for me reflects the media, really. It's a harsh light on the media. But this one, what's happened is, I think people have thought that this is hype because of the hype cycle. The media have thought, I know how this works. We boom it up and then it'll crash and then we can all have a laugh. They did that. They've done that a few times. They've tried to have a laugh. They've tried to say the models have plateaued. This isn't happening. But yet Llama 4 comes out 2 days ago. A new model comes out every 6 weeks. Operator comes out. Claude Code, like by far the most incredible piece of development software I've ever seen, is released. So it's broken the hype cycle. And I think once you can start to get that across to leaders, then I think they start to understand. And that's not to say it's easy to implement, and it's not to say everything should be AI, but it's to say that it's crucial that you have a plan.
To dive in there, though, just sort of quickly back to the point you're making about the concern or the risk, it's almost a little bit back to we're blaming the technology for poor understanding of data, right? And obviously we'll talk about this a little bit, but it's that fear of the stuff that you don't want to come out will come out. And even in the private models that they're building, they're using copilots or other things internally. It's because they were just feeding it everything. They didn't have a good understanding of what was going in. So of course it's going to return things you don't want it to. And I think there's that blurred line between the public and the private. The implementations are poor. We've seen lots and lots of, again, statistics about projects that have kicked off and then, pause because they say, oh, well, we didn't really have a good understanding of our data. We want to take advantage of it, but actually the first step is understanding what I have. So I take the point there that certainly very much has that link, and that's caused that risk problem. As you say, there's that lack of understanding at the top level too about how this really works.
I was going to say, and it probably draws on the same point. The boardrooms I'm talking to, is a super interesting conversation. Very much. The boards are hyped up about AI. So that's great, because at least they're talking about it. The boards are curious and inquisitive about the impact, and they're fearful of the downside risk, which I think is that parameterization. But because of the lack of technology depth in the boardroom, they don't have a framework for the conversations. For instance, I was literally talking to a mid-sized board last night here in Australia, trying to explain to them differential privacy and how these affected the models. And there are ways to add statistical noise and there are methods to deal with these things. But that language and that understanding of this math is complex and isn't as easy to grapple with, and how we start to build that language into senior leadership. I mean, how are you approaching that? Because until we understand these pieces, because that's the big boogeyman, I think.
Yeah.
AI, explain it to me. Well, I sat down, and no offense to my mother, I think she's a brilliant woman, but I sat down, she wanted to understand how ChatGPT worked. And my whiteboard writing's worse at the mess, that is bad at the best of times, as Chris will attest. It was just a mess. That's like I'd drawn this thing out for her. How do you approach that, Rob?
So it's a really, really good point, Anthony. And I come across this a lot. So a typical engagement, I'll end up in a situation where, and I've just had this happen, literally just had this happen, where the leadership have bought in. They are like, right, okay, we get it. We can see this is really important. We're building out a strategy. We're going to move forward. And they'll engage with you on a basis of, right, we want you to build these 5 tools, or, we want you to look at this particular solution. And one of the things that I try and push back on really, really hard, because it happens time and time again, is until you understand the technology first, you shouldn't choose what you're going to do. And so the way I actually do that is, what I tend to do is a full day with the C-level executive leadership team, the highest, or whatever structure it is, the highest team there is, of really just understanding what this is, starting with the history of AI and why are we talking about generative AI and not all these other forms? What is it? What is a large language model? And the really fascinating thing about that is that every couple of weeks I run one of these sessions, and every couple of weeks I have to rewrite it because, we are learning and evolving even our understanding of LLMs on a weekly basis. But I think, to your point, you're right. It's absolutely crucial that the first thing that is baked into the organization is an understanding of what this technology is. And it takes a day to really kind of get to a point where you've even got like a good enough high level understanding. And what is fascinating is then like an understanding of some of the risks, moving towards agentic models, some of the ways that these things work. Then what starts to happen is they say, okay, right, now I want to revise completely what I was trying to achieve in the first place. I say, I'm an AI consultant, and I say to all of my clients, don't hire an AI consultant. It's not a good long-term solution. Don't outsource your AI. So what I pitch is, what I want to do is build a sustainable AI practice within your organization. And so again, that's what isn't happening, I think. And that's what, once people start to understand it, what they start to say is, okay, yeah, what you need to do is start to actually build this stuff up from within. And that starts with an understanding. But it's challenging, right? Because there is so much misinformation out there. And some of it is very well-meaning misinformation. So there are still a lot of people, and both of you may be proponents of this model, that will say that these are next token predictors, and that's what they do. And then you look at some of the most recent research from Anthropic, and what they are seeing is when an LLM is trying to match a rhyme, the network is firing, and it's actually thinking about the second rhyme before it writes the first word. And so what they're seeing is these emergent properties of large-scale neural networks where they are displaying inherent reasoning in a non-reasoning LLM, and they are displaying forward and backward thinking, yet apparently they're next token predictors. And so again, you have this, and it is misinformation, but it's, as I say, it's well-meaning misinformation. It was us figuring out what we had with the data that we had at the time. And so that it's just this incredible extra layer of complexity. And what I find fascinating about this topic is, now go back and think about all of the development of like traditional programming and coding. There has never been a moment when there was a lack of understanding of the structure or the way that that worked. We understood all the way through all of the history of software development. We understood every single aspect of every single thing that was occurring. Whereas within AI, and especially now within these scaled up language models, it's really a black box and we don't understand what's going on inside it. And so how can anyone really understand? And every new model that comes out is a scale up of capability and a scale up of some of those challenges. So yeah, so I totally agree. I think that for me is the approach. Go in, teach first, learn. That has to be the way you do it. And then once you understand it, you can start to figure out what you want to do with it.
Yeah, you've bristled me a little bit on the next token thing. I'm going to have to drill in. I would absolutely 100% say they are still next token predictors. The point of reasoning is they're now doing a next token of pattern as opposed to next token of word. And it is still a mathematical concept running from the neural network to identify the patterns across that as opposed to the language and words that's going to be used. And in fact, I can prove some of that when you move to languages that are not English, particularly some of the more languages in Asia, the models start to behave in very strange ways. And so I know they're working on that, and I'm 100% positive it will be solved because it is just a different mathematical pattern. But I would still fundamentally stand on my view that they're very sophisticated pattern mimicking processes, but it's still another form of token.
Yeah, you should have a look at the Anthropic research. It only came out like a couple of weeks ago. But
I haven't read it. I'll be fair.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the tests they did was exactly what you have just said, because they expected exactly this. And what they started to find was even across multiple languages, these very common usage of some of the neurons. But again, I think a lot of this is an inherent property of the scaling up of these networks as well. That's interesting to see whether behavior starts to change organically as they scale. But yeah, it's a very contentious topic, and I get you.
I think it's really, really interesting. Anthony just made it a little bit easier. The T1000's not coming through the wall anytime soon. But ultimately, though, you were talking about this before about that AI hype, and I sort of touched on it a little bit, but you've got that AI demand that's coming from the employee, coming up from the bottom. You've got the board, as we've just discussed, that are bringing it down from the top as well. What's the challenge, though? How do we, in your experience, how do we deliver this? You spoke a little bit about the learning and building the practice internally, but for the audience, there's got to be more practical steps to this. We talked a little bit, as I said, about even not understanding the data element has created this risk. What are the key elements about how do we deliver safe, well-governed AI for that enterprise?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of components. So the first I'd say is to embrace your employees and understand what's happening. So that's step one. Like when we're talking about safety and when we're talking about shadow AI specifically, then what we're talking about is what you might deem the kind of misuse of AI across the organization. The first thing I've seen some organizations do, which I think is really great move, is to do an amnesty, and just say, look, we're looking at doing our policy right now. We're trying to understand what happens. We want to survey everyone and understand how you're all using AI because we want to embrace it and use it well. I think that kind of a positive attitude towards we're moving forward with this then allows you to open the door up to people from all across the department and the company say, well, I've been using it for this and I've been using it for this. And so that concept's great because ultimately what you're trying to do is get an understanding of what is happening out there. And you're never going to do that. You're not going to police this stuff away. So you need to understand it. I think then an understanding of the fact that just like back in the early days of social media and the internet, some of those people who were always messing around on social media, they became the social media manager for the company. And they became very successful social media managers for the company. And they were expressing this passion and interest in a specific piece of technology. Once that was realized to be actually quite a useful piece of technology, then they were brought forward. So in the same way, like you're trying to build a sustainable AI practice. So if you know who your people are, who the people are out there who are passionate about this stuff, bring them in and actually work with them. So I think there is this concept of understanding the issue across your organization and then actually capitalizing on that, because sometimes it's just a case of ticking a box, them understanding the challenges and the concerns, and that they should never put PII information in there or customer information in there and that sort of side of things, but really embracing them. Once you start to get that feeling and the feeling of how much this technology is being used, then it is just about strategy. It's about policy. It's about understanding where you're going to use this stuff and picking the appropriate tools. Again, all of these platforms have enterprise versions with full compliance with SSO into your own environment, with security, role-based security, all these different levels and tools. So for me, that's the key. The key is, first of all, understanding usage, then embracing the people who are using it and starting to use them to understand what you can do to leverage it. And then it's just looking at that. Now you've got that picture and saying, right, what do we need to implement across the organization to allow this to continue and to be able to control it? And for some organizations, that literally is just saying, we're going to set up ChatGPT teams, or we're going to set up Gemini, we're going to use Copilot. It's funny, you were talking earlier about some of the challenges that lots of data create. I'm personally not a fan of Copilot because I think that's one of the issues that's happened is bad implementations of Copilot with a lot of access to a lot of data have caused some of this challenge. And so I would say what's almost more important sometimes than policing external usage is correctly implementing internal tool sets, because that really can get you in trouble. When I've seen this, when someone in a certain department is asking what the salary of the CEO is, and this thing's accessing the HR records and pulling out the salary of the CEO, because, that saved the HR team a lot of time. But now all of a sudden we've got a massive problem. And that, if I was looking at AI use from a security perspective and risk, that's really where the risk lies, is once you get to implementation, how you implement something across the organization. But in terms of shadow AI, that's exactly where I would focus. Pull those people in, get to know them, understand what they're doing, and then capitalize on that.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in those things around the capitalization. What do you predict a year from now looks like? I'm not even going to ask further than that because I think it's just so far out and the change is too fast. Do you think that we'll be at a place where organizations are starting to look at those controls so they can capitalize on it? Because the big issue that we're observing is the failure rate's still quite high. And the hype has created a lot of interest in the boardroom, like we talked about earlier. Yeah, me personally, I know Chris is the same. We're really integrating it into our work practices. But the way we're doing it is using Anthropic and some of these better tools. What we're seeing in the corporate land is a really different flavor of what's rolling out.
Yeah, I say this a lot. Quite often, the killer app is not the automation tool in this team or the customer success piece over here. The killer app quite often is broad adoption of AI tools with good training across all staff. And so, I go on about this, but like going into an organization and rolling out just ChatGPT teams across everyone and training everyone and showing them how to use it responsibly, like often yields a far greater return on investment than this whole piece of work over here. I think part of the challenge you have right now is when you get into those big enterprise deployments, then again, I'm going to be contentious and I don't mean to be, but then like traditional engineering gets involved. And in my experience, building with engineers with AI, what happens a lot of the time is they try and programmatically engineer the solution rather than allow the AI freedom, especially if we're talking Gen AI, allow the AI freedom to do what it needs to do. When we have a problem, when we are building out an automation, I'm a big fan of giving the AI unstructured, like low rule sets, allowing it to create the data itself, allowing like very narrow use case, very small agentic AI models that will go in, perform one task. And then what you see is an incredibly low hallucination rate, incredibly low failure rate. And you create these really interesting structures. But when I'm working with engineers, when we have a problem, what will happen is we will try and fix it in code. And I'm saying this phrase more than ever. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Just let me talk to it. And actually, I'll go away and talk to it and I'll make it output the JSON better than it's outputting now. You don't need to program in controls around that, because the big challenge with large scale enterprise AI implementations and automations is that this stuff is moving so quickly, they are out of date within days. And you need to be able to move up to that next model. But if you put in all these layers of control, the next model probably doesn't need those layers of control. And so now you've broken it because you're treating it like a child. It's now a teenager and it won't like those constraints. So the most successful implementations I've worked with are very loose, exposing all the prompts and allowing us to change them as they go, allowing the AI, giving the AI trust to build the data structure, not enforcing it, even creating some dynamic and self-creating data structures where we're not even defining fact like types like this is a risk, this is a requirement, this is a project manager. All we're doing is saying this is a fact, this is a fact category, this is a fact copy, and we're letting the AI create its own categories and almost dynamically generate the database. So I think what you're seeing at the moment is just people not understanding how this stuff works. And they're trying to still place the old rules in the new world. And where we are actually headed is much looser and it's much more about giving trust to the AI. And often, Sam Altman said this, but often building for the next model, understanding where it's headed and trying to almost hit that point that might be 6 months out and build for that model and kind of ignore the fact that it's not working right now on the basis that it will work then. But yet that's not the way these enterprise installations of AI go. The one other thing I'd say that causes them to fail is there is still a lack of understanding of just how much impact several people within the organization who are really anti-AI can have. And so buy-in from the organization up front and an understanding of who your champions are and of who the challengers might be, I think is really, really important. Like in my experience, again, a lot of these fail because whoever it be, a VP in QA or engineering or marketing or whatever, is just really like, no way is this going to work. I'm not going to let it. And I've seen that happen time and time again as well. And it's a fragile new world. So it's quite easy for someone just to destroy it by forcing it down a road that you don't want it to go down.
Yeah, no, I think there's great points. And I think, again, having that opportunity to look back at this with your own eyes there, Rob, I think it's super interesting for the listeners. I know certainly we can continue to talk, and I'd love to maybe put the offer out there that in 6 months' time or towards the end of the season, we may even come back and hit you up and go again and go, well, how far did we get along this way? Has everybody taken that opportunity to do those things? I think there's a lot more here to unpack, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to have that chat with you today.
I'm working on the mathematical proof. I'm going to find Rob in the UK in London somewhere. I'm going to find a pub and I'm taking through.
No, he's just up the road from me in Ontario, mate.
Did you notice how I stealthily avoided ending on a really downer, which would have been what would have happened if I had said what I think the world will be like in 1 year even. So, I skipped that one. So I'll save that for next time.
Beautiful.
We're Australian. We don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Excellent. Look, thanks again, Robert. I really do appreciate it. Certainly for the listeners here, we'll be definitely looking out for Anthony's proof points that he'll send out, and there'll be something in the news as you tear it to pieces. Again, I'll probably have to end up standing in the middle, but that's all good. Look,
we'll get that inserted into the pod notes.
We'll get that. Well, absolutely. I'm sure that people will be enthralled and waiting for your mathematical proof as always. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris Brown.
And I'm Anthony Woodward. I'll see you next time on Filed.